The sun sank behind the distant mountains, painting the Nevada sky in brilliant streaks of orange and red as Lillian Shaw wiped sweat from her brow and adjusted the supplies loaded onto her wagon, unaware that the slight headache she felt would soon become a battle for her very life. The year was 1874, and at 22, Lillian had already known more hardship than most people twice her age. 3 years after losing her parents to a smallpox outbreak in San Francisco, she had finally saved enough money working as a seamstress to purchase a small parcel of land outside McGill, Nevada. The small, ramshackle cabin situated on 10 acres of hardscrabble land wasn't much, but it was hers. "Miss Shaw, are you certain you won't stay another night?" Mr. Henderson, the general store owner, asked as he handed her the last sack of flour. "There's talk of bandits on the North Road, and that's a mighty long journey for a woman alone." Lillian offered a polite smile but shook her head firmly. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Henderson, but I've been delayed in town long enough. My livestock needs tending, and I can't afford to lose any more time." She didn't mention the dull throbbing behind her eyes that had started that morning. It was probably just exhaustion from the last 3 days of arranging supplies and finalizing paperwork for her land deed. "At least take this," he said, handing her a small revolver. "It was my wife's. She'd want you to have it." Lillian hesitated before accepting the weapon. "Thank you. I'll return it when next I'm in town." "See that you do by bringing yourself back safely," he replied with grandfatherly concern. As she climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins, Lillian felt another wave of dizziness wash over her. She blinked it away, attributing it to the heat and her eagerness to get home. The journey to her homestead would take nearly 2 days with a fully loaded wagon, but she was determined to cover as much ground as possible before nightfall. 20 miles outside of McGill, the headache intensified. Lillian's hands trembled as she guided the horses, and her skin felt unusually sensitive, as though her clothes were made of sandpaper instead of cotton. By dusk, when she stopped to make camp, she could barely summon the strength to unhitch the horses. "Just need to rest," she murmured to herself as she slumped against a tree, too weary to even set up her bedroll properly. The night air that should have brought relief from the day's heat did nothing to cool her burning skin. She dreamed of fire and ice, of her mother's cool hand on her forehead, of her father's strong arms carrying her to bed. When dawn broke, Lillian opened her eyes to find the world tilting strangely around her. The simple act of standing sent waves of nausea through her body. With trembling hands, she managed to hitch the horses back to the wagon, knowing that she needed to press on. Her homestead was still a day's journey away, but turning back to McGill would take just as long. "Just a little farther," she whispered to herself, to the horses, to the vast wilderness surrounding her. "Just a little farther." The terrain grew more rugged as she veered off the main trail, taking the shortcut to her property that wound through hills and narrow canyons. By midday, Lillian could no longer deny that something was seriously wrong. The fever that had been building steadily now raged through her body like wildfire. Her vision blurred, and the reins slipped from her grasp. The wagon lurched as the horses, sensing their driver's weakened state, slowed to a confused stop at the edge of a small creek. Lillian tried to call out to urge them forward, but her voice emerged as little more than a rasp. With the last of her strength, she climbed down from the wagon, intending to splash water on her face, but her legs buckled beneath her. As darkness claimed her, Lillian's final coherent thought was that no one knew where she was, no one would find her, and the life she had fought so hard to build was slipping away before it had truly begun. Miles away, Preston Abernathy guided his horse across the rugged landscape with the ease of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. At 31, he had the weathered face of someone who lived beneath the open sky, his skin tanned by the sun, and his blue eyes crinkled at the corners from years of squinting against the harsh light of the Nevada desert. He wasn't supposed to be riding through this part of the territory. His job as a cattle driver for the Wilcox Ranch typically kept him busy with the herd, but a chance encounter with an old friend in McGill had led to this detour. The friend, Dr. Simmons, had mentioned a young woman who had recently purchased land in the area. "All alone out there, Doctor," Simmons had said with a worried frown. "Smart as a whip, but these lands ain't kind to even the strongest men, let alone a city-bred woman. If you're heading back that way, might be worth checking on her." Preston had agreed more out of politeness than genuine concern. Women who came to stake their claim in these parts usually had more grit than most men gave them credit for. Still, a promise was a promise, and the detour only added half a day to his journey back to the ranch. As he followed the creek that cut through the rough country leading to the Shaw homestead, Preston noticed fresh wagon tracks veering in the same direction. Perhaps the woman had already made it back from town. He was about to turn his horse and continue on his way when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A wagon stopped haphazardly by the creek, horses still hitched but grazing nervously, and a crumpled form on the ground nearby. Preston spurred his horse forward, dismounting before the animal had fully stopped. He knelt beside the unconscious woman, alarmed by the heat radiating from her skin. Her face was flushed crimson, her blonde hair damp with sweat and plastered to her forehead. "Miss, can you hear me?" he called, gently turning her over. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with delicate features contorted in pain even in unconsciousness. This had to be Lillian Shaw, the woman Dr. Simmons had mentioned. Preston placed a hand on her forehead and muttered a curse under his breath. The fever burning through her was dangerously high. He quickly assessed their situation. They were at least a day's journey from her homestead, based on what the doctor had told him, and even further from town. The woman clearly needed medical attention, but moving her in this condition could be just as dangerous as leaving her. Making his decision, Preston gathered her in his arms and carried her to a shaded spot beneath a large cottonwood tree. He retrieved his canteen and bedroll from his horse, then quickly set up a makeshift camp. After wetting his bandana with cool creek water, he gently placed it on her forehead, noting with concern how quickly it warmed from her skin. "Miss Shaw," he said firmly, hoping his voice might reach her through the fever. "I need you to wake up if you can. I'm Preston Abernathy. Dr. Simmons asked me to check on you." Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. A soft moan escaped her lips, the only indication that she'd heard him at all. Preston frowned. He had basic knowledge of treating injuries every cowboy did, but fever sicknesses were beyond his expertise. The woman needed a doctor, but McGill was nearly 2 days away, and the nearest ranch might be just as far. He couldn't leave her alone in this state, but staying here with limited supplies wasn't a solution either. As the afternoon waned, Preston managed to get some water into her, supporting her head as she swallowed weakly. He built a small fire and prepared a simple broth from his supplies, hoping the nourishment might help strengthen her. Throughout the night, he kept vigilant watch, replacing the wet cloth on her forehead whenever it grew too warm and speaking softly to her when she thrashed in feverish delirium. By dawn, Preston knew he needed to make a difficult choice. Lillian's condition hadn't improved. If anything, her breathing had become more labored, and she alternated between shivering violently and burning with heat. "I need to get you help," he told her as he carefully wrapped her in his blanket. I'm going to secure your wagon and leave you with supplies. I'll ride to McGill as fast as I can and bring back the doctor." Whether she understood him or not, Preston couldn't say, but as he prepared to move her to a more sheltered spot, her hand suddenly clutched his arm with surprising strength. "No," she whispered, her eyes opening slightly to reveal fever-bright hazel irises. "Please, don't leave me here." Her voice was so fragile, so desperate that Preston found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the implications. "All right," he said softly. "I won't leave you, but we need to get you proper help." After a moment's thought, Preston came up with a new plan. He would take her with him on his horse, leaving the wagon secured by the creek. They would make for the Shaw homestead, which was closer than town. Once there, he could make her comfortable and then ride for help. With gentle care, Preston gathered Lillian into his arms. She felt alarmingly light as he carried her to his horse. Mounting while holding her securely required all his strength and skill, but soon they were moving at a careful pace across the rugged terrain, her body cradled against his chest. "Stay with me, Miss Shaw," he murmured against her hair as she drifted in and out of consciousness. "Just stay with me." The journey was painfully slow. Preston had to keep the horse at a walk to avoid jostling Lillian too much, and he stopped frequently to give her water and check her condition. By late afternoon, they had covered less than half the distance to her homestead, and Preston was forced to make camp again as darkness approached. That night, her fever spiked dangerously high. Preston bathed her face and wrists with cool water, his worry deepening with each hour that passed. In her delirium, she called out for her mother and father, her words often dissolving into incoherent murmurs. "Please," she whispered during a moment of clarity, her fingers clutching weakly at his shirt. "Don't let me die here." "You're not going to die," Preston promised with a conviction he didn't entirely feel. "I won't let that happen." As he held her through the worst of the fever, Preston found himself studying her face in the firelight. Even ravaged by illness, there was a quiet strength in her features, a determined set to her jaw that spoke of someone who had faced adversity before. He wondered what had driven her to stake a claim alone in this harsh country, what dreams she carried that were worth such risk. By morning, Preston had made a new decision. The homestead was still too far, and Lillian's condition was deteriorating rapidly. They needed to get to a doctor, and quickly. The closest option was Fort Bridger, where a military physician might be able to help. It was a hard 3-day ride, but Preston knew it was their best chance. "Change of plans, Miss Shaw," he told her as he prepared for their departure. "We're going to get you proper medical help." Securing her on his horse once more, Preston set out with grim determination. He rode as quickly as he dared, constantly aware of the precious burden in his arms. Throughout the day, he talked to her, telling her about the Wilcox Ranch where he worked, about the wild mustangs he'd seen in the high country, about anything he could think of to keep a connection between them. Whether it was his voice or simply her own will to live, Lillian occasionally responded with a squeeze of her hand or a murmured word. Each small sign that she was still fighting gave Preston renewed determination. That night, as they camped beneath a vast canopy of stars, Preston finally allowed himself to acknowledge the fear that had been growing within him. He was afraid for this woman he barely knew, afraid that despite his efforts, he might fail her. The realization was unsettling for a man who prided himself on his self-sufficiency and emotional restraint. "You're quite troublesome, you know that," he said softly as he adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. "I was supposed to be back at the ranch 2 days ago." To his surprise, a faint smile touched her lips. "Sorry," she whispered, her eyes still closed. Preston chuckled, relief flooding through him at this small sign of awareness. "Don't be. "It's the most excitement I've had in months." Dawn of the second day brought no improvement. If anything, Lillian seemed weaker, her skin pale beneath the flush of fever. Preston pushed on relentlessly, allowing himself and his horse only the briefest rests. The terrain grew more difficult as they approached the mountains they would need to cross to reach Fort Bridger, but Preston navigated it with the skill of a man who had spent his life in these lands. By nightfall, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to continue until the moon rose high enough to illuminate the trail. When he finally stopped, it was because his horse could go no further without rest. As he settled Lillian on his bedroll, Preston realized with alarm that her breathing had become shallow and rapid. Her skin burned against his hand, and when he tried to get her to drink, most of the water simply trickled down her chin. Desperation clawed at him as he held her through the night, whispering encouragements and prayers in equal measure. By first light, Preston knew they couldn't wait any longer. Fort Bridger was still a day away, and Lillian might not survive the journey. He remembered passing a small mining settlement the previous year, tucked into the foothills they had just entered. It wasn't much a collection of rough cabins and claims, but where there were miners, there was often someone with rudimentary medical knowledge. Changing direction, Preston pushed his exhausted horse toward the settlement, hoping against hope that his memory served him correctly. By midday, smoke from cook fires appeared on the horizon, and relief surged through him as the cluster of buildings came into view. The settlement, little more than a wide spot in the trail with a dozen structures, was called Prosperity, though it had clearly seen better days. Preston rode directly to the largest building, a combination saloon and general store Lillian held securely against him. "Help!" he called as he dismounted carefully, struggling to maintain his hold on her. "Is there a doctor here?" Several men emerged from the saloon, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern as they took in the situation. "No doctor," said a grizzled older man with a limp. "But Martha Wilson was a nurse during the war. Her place is just down the way." One of the younger miners ran to fetch her while others helped Preston carry Lillian into the saloon, clearing a table for her to lie on. Within minutes, a stern-faced woman in her 50s arrived, rolling up her sleeves as she approached. "How long has she been like this?" Martha asked, her fingers pressed against Lillian's wrist, counting her pulse. "Found her 3 days ago, already burning with fever," Preston explained, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. "Been trying to get her to help ever since." Martha nodded briskly, her experienced hands moving efficiently as she examined Lillian. "Looks like typhoid to me," she said after a few minutes. "Had a lot of it during the war. She needs medicine, proper care." "You have what's needed?" Preston asked, hope flickering in his chest. The woman's expression turned grim. "Some basics, but not the quinine that would help most." "That would have to come from Fort Bridger or maybe even Salt Lake City." Preston's heart sank. They had come so far only to face the same problem. "How long does she have?" Martha's eyes softened with sympathy. "Hard to say. She's young and strong, or she wouldn't have lasted this long. But without proper medicine, 3 days, maybe less." The reality of those words hit Preston like a physical blow. 3 days. After everything, after the miles they'd traveled together, after the nights he'd held her through the worst of the fever, it couldn't end like this. "Where's the nearest place to get this quinine?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Fort Bridger would be your best bet," Martha replied. "It's still a day and a half from here." Preston straightened his shoulders, decision made. "I'll go." "Can you keep her alive until I return?" Martha studied him with newfound respect. "I'll do everything I can, but you should know even if you make it back in time, there's no guarantee the medicine will work." "It's a chance," Preston said simply. And right now, a chance is all we have." Within the hour, Preston was back in the saddle, this time on a fresh horse borrowed from one of the miners in exchange for his own exhausted mount. The animal was sturdy but not particularly fast still. It was better than continuing on his tired horse. As he prepared to leave, Martha pulled him aside. "You're going an awful long way for a woman you barely know," she observed. Preston didn't have a ready answer for that. It was true that he hardly knew Lillian Shaw, but over the past 3 days, watching her fight so hard for her life, something had shifted within him. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself. "Just seems like the right thing to do," he finally said. Martha's weathered face cracked into a knowing smile. "Well, you'd better hurry back. I told her you were going for medicine, and she made me promise to give you a message." "What message?" Preston asked, curious despite his urgency to depart. "She said, 'Tell him thank you for not leaving me alone.'" Martha's expression softened. "Now get going, Cowboy. That girl's waiting on you." With those words echoing in his mind, Preston set off toward Fort Bridger at a punishing pace. The journey was brutal, the terrain unforgiving, but he pushed forward with single-minded determination. He allowed himself and the horse only minimal rest, eating in the saddle and stopping just long enough to let the animal drink and catch its breath. By the following evening, the outlines of Fort Bridger appeared on the horizon, its buildings silhouetted against the setting sun. Preston had made the journey in just over a day, nearly half the time it would normally take. His body ached from the endless hours in the saddle, and exhaustion clouded his vision, but none of that mattered as he urged the horse toward the fort. The military physician, a Captain Joseph Miller, was initially reluctant to part with his limited supply of quinine, especially for a civilian he'd never met. But something in Preston's desperate appearance, the dust-covered clothes, the red-rimmed eyes, the absolute refusal to take no for an answer convinced him. "This woman must be very important to you," Captain Miller observed as he measured out the precious medicine. Preston didn't correct the assumption. "She needs this more than I need sleep," he said simply. The captain nodded, handing over the medicine along with detailed instructions for its use. "Godspeed, Mr. Abernathy. I hope you make it back in time." Those words followed Preston as he mounted his borrowed horse once more and turned back toward Prosperity. The animal was nearly spent, but Preston had no choice but to push on. Every hour, every minute might make the difference between life and death for Lillian. The return journey blurred into an endless series of desperate miles. Preston rode through the night, guided by moonlight and sheer will. When his horse finally stumbled, too exhausted to continue, Preston found himself on foot, leading the animal as he continued forward. Dawn of the 3rd day found him still miles from Prosperity, his legs leaden and his mind fogged with fatigue. The borrowed horse had recovered enough to bear his weight again, but their pace was painfully slow. As the sun climbed higher, Preston fought against the fear that he might be too late. It was mid-afternoon when he finally rode into the mining settlement, the small bottle of quinine clutched in his hand like a talisman. People emerged from buildings as he passed, their expressions telling him everything before he even reached Martha Wilson's cabin. "You made it," Martha said as she rushed out to meet him. "I wasn't sure you would." "Is she—" Preston couldn't finish the question, fear choking the words in his throat. "Still with us," Martha assured him quickly. "But only just. The fever peaked last night. I wasn't sure she'd see morning." Relief weakened Preston's knees as he dismounted. "I have the medicine," he said, holding out the bottle with trembling hands. Martha took it, examining the label with approval. "This might just save her life. Come on, she's been asking for you." Preston followed Martha into the small cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs. Lillian lay on a narrow bed, her face ghostly pale except for the bright spots of fever on her cheeks. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than he remembered. "Look who's back," Martha said loudly, trying to rouse Lillian from her fitful sleep. "And he's brought what you need." Lillian's eyelids fluttered open, her gaze unfocused at first, then clearing slightly as she registered Preston's presence. "You came back," she whispered, the words barely audible. Preston moved to her bedside, taking her hot, dry hand in his. "I promised I wouldn't leave you," he said hoarsely. A ghost of a smile touched her cracked lips. "Thank you." Martha bustled around them, preparing the medicine according to the doctor's instructions. "This isn't going to taste pleasant," she warned as she held the spoon to Lillian's lips. "But you need to get it all down." Preston supported Lillian's head as she grimaced through taking the bitter medicine. When she had swallowed the last drop, he eased her back against the pillows, his hand lingering on her shoulder. "Now what?" he asked Martha, not taking his eyes off Lillian. "Now we wait," Martha replied grimly. "The next 24 hours will tell us if the medicine works. She'll need doses every few hours, and you," she added, fixing Preston with a stern look, "need sleep before you collapse." Preston shook his head. "I'm staying with her." "Didn't say you weren't," Martha countered. "There's room enough for you to stretch out on the floor. But you won't do her any good if you're dead on your feet." Recognizing the wisdom in her words, Preston reluctantly settled on a pallet Martha arranged near Lillian's bed. Despite his determination to stay awake, 3 days of relentless riding caught up with him, and he fell into an exhausted sleep almost immediately. He woke to darkness and the sound of whimpering. Disoriented for a moment, Preston sat up quickly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of a single oil lamp turned low. Lillian was thrashing weakly on the bed, caught in the grip of fever dreams. Martha, who had been dozing in a chair, was already at her side, trying to calm her. "No, please," Lillian murmured, her voice threaded with fear. "Don't leave me alone again." Preston moved to the bedside, taking her hand in his. "You're not alone," he said firmly. "I'm right here, Lillian." Whether it was the sound of his voice or the touch of his hand, something reached through her delirium. She quieted, her fingers curling around his with surprising strength. Martha gave him an approving nod. "You have a good effect on her. Keep talking to her while I prepare the next dose." Throughout the long night, Preston maintained his vigil, talking softly to Lillian during her moments of consciousness, wiping her brow with cool cloths when the fever burned hottest, and simply holding her hand when there was nothing else to be done. Martha administered the medicine at regular intervals, her experienced eyes measuring each small change in Lillian's condition. Dawn brought no dramatic improvement, but Martha seemed cautiously optimistic. "Her pulse is stronger," she told Preston, "and the fever hasn't risen further." "That's something." By midday, Lillian was sleeping more peacefully, her breathing less labored. Preston, who had refused to leave her side except for the briefest necessities, felt hope beginning to replace the dread that had been his constant companion. As evening approached, Preston was dozing in the chair beside Lillian's bed when he felt a slight pressure on his hand. Opening his eyes, he found her watching him, her gaze clearer than it had been in days. "You look terrible," she whispered, the ghost of a smile on her lips. A startled laugh escaped him. "That's rich coming from you," he replied, relief making him light-headed. "How long have I been sick?" she asked, struggling to piece together fragmented memories. "About 6 days now," Preston told her. "You've had quite a journey." Confusion clouded her features. "I remember leaving McGill, then nothing until glimpses of you carrying me, talking to me." She paused, her brow furrowing. "You went somewhere, for medicine," Preston nodded. "To Fort Bridger. It was the closest place to get what you needed." That's at least 3 days' ride, she said, her eyes widening with the realization. A bit less if you don't stop much, Preston replied with a slight shrug, as if his grueling journey had been nothing extraordinary. Lillian studied his face, taking in the exhaustion etched in every line, the several days' growth of beard, the clothes rumpled from sleeping in them. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" she asked softly. Preston looked down at their still joined hands, considering his answer. "When I found you by that creek," he finally said, "you asked me not to leave you alone. Something in the way you said it, I just couldn't." Tears filled Lillian's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving my life." Martha entered the room then, breaking the moment with her brisk efficiency. She checked Lillian's temperature and pulse, her face breaking into a wide smile. "The fever's breaking," she announced. "You're not out of the woods yet, young lady, but I think you're going to make it." Over the next 2 days, Lillian's condition improved steadily. The fever receded completely, and though she remained weak, her natural color began to return. Preston continued to stay close, helping her sit up to take broth and tea, reading to her from an old book of poetry Martha had on her shelf, and telling her stories of his life as a cowboy. In turn, Lillian began to share pieces of her own story, her childhood in San Francisco, the loss of her parents, her determination to build a life on her own terms. "My father always said I was too stubborn for my own good," she told Preston with a rueful smile. "I suppose nearly dying from fever miles from anywhere proves his point. Or maybe your stubbornness is what kept you alive until I found you," Preston countered. "Some might call it strength." On the morning of the 3rd day after her fever broke, Lillian was sitting up in bed, looking almost like herself again, when Preston entered with news. "I've arranged for us to travel back to your homestead," he said. "One of the miners is heading toward McGill in a few days. He's offered to take us in his wagon. It'll be more comfortable for you than riding." Lillian's face lit up at the mention of her homestead. "I can't believe I've been away for so long. My poor animals." "Actually," Preston said with a slight smile, "I sent word to McGill about what happened. The storekeeper Henderson, I believe, said he'd have someone check on your place until you return." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes. "You thought of everything, didn't you?" Preston shrugged, oddly embarrassed by her gratitude. "Seemed like the right thing to do." 3 days later, Lillian was deemed strong enough to travel. Martha had grown fond of her patient, and she fussed over Lillian as they prepared to leave, pressing a packet of herbal remedies into her hands and extracting promises to be more careful in the future. "And you," she said to Preston, drawing him aside, "you make sure she doesn't overdo it. That girl's got more determination than sense sometimes." Preston nodded solemnly. "Yes, madam, I've noticed that about her." The journey back to Lillian's homestead was slow but uneventful. The miner, a taciturn man named Hank, seemed content to let them be, only occasionally joining their conversation when the topic interested him. For the most part, Preston and Lillian were left to themselves, their relationship evolving with each passing mile. They spoke of trivial things and important ones, learning the contours of each other's lives and dreams. Preston told her about his years as a cowboy, about the freedom he found in the open range and the loneliness that sometimes accompanied it. Lillian shared her hopes for her homestead, the vegetable garden she planned to plant, the goats she hoped to raise. "It won't be easy," Preston observed. "Homesteading never is, especially alone." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Lillian replied with the quiet dignity that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "And I'm not afraid of being alone. I've been taking care of myself for a long time." "I believe you," Preston said softly, "but everyone needs help sometimes." Something shifted in her expression then, a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "I'm beginning to see that," she admitted. By the time they reached the turnoff to Lillian's property, something had changed between them, an unspoken understanding, a connection forged through shared struggle and quiet conversations beneath star-filled skies. When they finally arrived at her homestead, Lillian's eyes filled with tears at the sight of the small cabin, still standing despite her absence. True to Henderson's word, someone had indeed been by. The livestock had been tended, and there were even fresh tracks around the well. As Hank helped unload their few belongings, Preston found himself hesitating. He had accomplished what he'd set out to do. Lillian was home, safe and recovering. There was no reason for him to stay any longer. The Wilcox Ranch would be wondering where he was. He'd been gone far longer than intended. Yet the thought of leaving brought an unexpected ache to his chest. In the 2 weeks since he'd found her by that creek, Lillian Shaw had somehow become important to him in a way he couldn't quite define. Lillian seemed to sense his conflict. After Hank departed with a gruff farewell, she turned to Preston, her expression carefully neutral. "You'll be wanting to get back to your ranch," she said. "They must be missing you by now." Preston nodded slowly. "I should check in, let them know I'm all right." "Of course," she agreed, her eyes dropping to the ground. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done, Mr. Abernathy. I owe you my life." The formality in her voice stung more than he expected. "Preston," he corrected gently. "After all we've been through, I think you can call me Preston." A smile touched her lips briefly. "Preston," she repeated. "And I'm Lillian." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with words neither seemed ready to speak. Finally, Preston cleared his throat. "I was thinking," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Your wagon is still out there by the creek. You'll need it back." Hope flickered in Lillian's eyes. "Yes, I suppose I will. And you're not fully recovered yet. Wouldn't be right to leave you here alone, not until you're back on your feet properly." Her smile grew wider. "Martha did say I shouldn't overdo it." "Exactly," Preston agreed, relief washing through him. "So maybe I could stay a few more days, help you get settled, retrieve your wagon. Then head back to the ranch." "I'd like that," Lillian said softly. "Very much." The next few days established a gentle rhythm between them. Preston tended to the heavier chores, chopping wood, checking the small barn's roof, retrieving water from the well, while Lillian gradually resumed care of her animals and began putting her house in order. Each evening they shared simple meals at her rough-hewn table, talking long into the night. On the third day, Preston rode out to retrieve her wagon, returning triumphantly with it and all her supplies intact. The grateful smile she gave him warmed something deep inside him, a feeling he was becoming increasingly unwilling to examine too closely. That night, as they sat on her small porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, Lillian finally asked the question that had been hovering between them. "Why did you really come looking for me that day? The truth, please." Preston considered deflecting but found he couldn't lie to her. "Dr. Simmons in McGill mentioned you'd bought land out here, asked me to check on you since I was heading this way." He paused, then added quietly, "But that's not why I stayed, not why I rode to Fort Bridger." Lillian's eyes met his, questioning. "Then why?" Preston looked out at the darkening landscape, searching for words to explain something he barely understood himself. "At first, it was just the right thing to do. You needed help, and I was there to give it." He turned back to her, his expression earnest. "But somewhere along the way, between finding you at that creek and watching you fight so hard to live, it became more than that. You became more than just someone who needed saving." Color rose in Lillian's cheeks, visible even in the fading light. "And what am I now?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Preston reached across the space separating them, his calloused hand covering her smaller one. "Someone I'm not ready to say goodbye to," he admitted. "Someone I'd like to know better if you'd allow it." Lillian turned her hand beneath his, their fingers intertwining. "I'd like that too," she whispered. The next morning, Preston announced his intention to ride to the Wilcox ranch. "I need to explain my absence," he told Lillian over breakfast, "and collect my things if they haven't given my bunk away already." Concern clouded her features. "You won't lose your position because of me, will you?" Preston smiled reassuringly. "Old man Wilcox is fair. Once he hears the story, he'll understand. Besides," he added with a wink, "I'm the best horse breaker he's got. He won't want to lose me." "How long will you be gone?" Lillian asked, trying to keep her voice casual despite the anxiety the question revealed. "2 days to get there, a day to settle things, 2 days back," Preston calculated. "5 days, give or take," Lillian nodded, forcing a smile. "I'll be fine on my own. I'm nearly fully recovered now." Preston studied her face, reading the uncertainty behind her brave words. "I will come back," he promised solemnly. "That's not even a question." The sincerity in his voice eased some of her worry. "I'll hold you to that, Cowboy." Before he left, Preston helped Lillian secure everything around the homestead, making sure she had easy access to firewood and water. As he prepared to mount his horse, he hesitated, then turned back to her. Without a word, he pulled her gently into his arms, his embrace conveying what he wasn't yet ready to say aloud. Lillian returned the embrace, her head resting against his chest. 5 days, she reminded him as they reluctantly parted. "I'll be counting the hours," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. The journey to the Wilcox ranch gave Preston plenty of time to think, to sort through the unexpected turn his life had taken. He had never considered himself the settling down type. The freedom of the cowboy life had always suited him, no permanent ties, no responsibilities beyond the job at hand. Yet now, riding away from Lillian's homestead, he felt a pull to return that was stronger than anything he'd experienced before. By the time he reached the ranch, Preston had come to several realizations, not the least of which was that his future might look very different than he had imagined just weeks ago. Old man Wilcox was indeed understanding about Preston's extended absence, particularly after hearing the full story. "Sounds like quite an adventure," the rancher said, puffing on his pipe. "And quite a woman." "She is that," Preston agreed, unable to keep the admiration from his voice. Wilcox studied him shrewdly. "You planning on going back to her?" Preston nodded. "Yes, sir, I gave my word." "And after that?" The older man pressed. "You planning on coming back here? Or has this woman staked a claim on more than just her land?" The question caught Preston off guard, though he realized it shouldn't have. Wilcox had always been perceptive. "I'm not entirely sure yet," Preston admitted, "but I think I might be ready for something different." Wilcox nodded, as if this confirmed what he already suspected. "Well, you've been a good hand, Abernathy. If you decide to move on, I'll understand. And if things don't work out with this woman, there'll be a place for you here." "Thank you, sir," Preston said, grateful for the older man's understanding. The next day, Preston collected his wages and packed his few belongings. Several of the other cowboys ribbed him good-naturedly about being lassoed by a city girl, but there was genuine warmth in their farewells. "Never thought I'd see the day Preston Abernathy would settle down," remarked Charlie, one of the older hands. "She must be something special." "She is," Preston replied simply. He set out for Lillian's homestead the following morning, his saddlebags heavier with supplies he'd purchased, and a small gift wrapped carefully in brown paper. The journey back seemed both longer and shorter than before, longer because of his eagerness to see Lillian again, shorter because this time he rode with purpose rather than uncertainty. When he finally crested the rise that overlooked her property, Preston pulled his horse to a stop, taking in the scene below. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, and he could see Lillian in the small garden plot she'd started, her blonde hair gleaming in the sunlight. The sight filled him with a contentment he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. He urged his horse forward, and as if sensing his presence, Lillian looked up. The smile that spread across her face as she recognized him sent his heart racing, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. Lillian dropped her gardening tools and hurried toward him as he dismounted. Without hesitation, she threw her arms around his neck, her joy at his return unrestrained. "You came back," she breathed against his neck. Preston held her tightly, breathing in the scent of her hair, sunshine, and lavender. "I told you I would," he murmured. When they finally separated, Lillian's cheeks were flushed with happiness and perhaps a touch of embarrassment at her enthusiastic greeting. "How was your trip?" she asked, leading him toward the cabin. "Did everything go all right at the ranch?" "Better than expected," Preston replied, tethering his horse before following her inside. "Wilcox was understanding about my absence, even said there'd be a place for me if I wanted to come back." Lillian's steps faltered slightly at his words. "And do you want to go back, I mean?" Preston gently turned her to face him. "Not unless I have a very good reason to," he said softly. Hope and uncertainty warred in her expression. What would constitute a very good reason? Instead of answering directly, Preston reached into his saddlebag and withdrew the small package he'd brought. "I got you something," he said, offering it to her. Lillian took it with curious hands, carefully unwrapping the brown paper. Inside was a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of wildflowers. She opened it to find a delicate silver locket on a chain. "Preston," she gasped, lifting it carefully. "It's beautiful. Open it," he encouraged. Inside the locket was a tiny pressed flower, a desert primrose, its delicate petals preserved between two thin pieces of glass. "I found it near where I first found you," Preston explained. "It reminded me of you, something beautiful and resilient blooming in the harshest conditions." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes as she looked up at him. "This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." Preston took her hands in his expression serious. "Lillian, these past weeks have changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. All I know for certain is that being with you feels right in a way nothing else ever has." He paused, gathering his courage. "I don't know what the future holds. I can't promise it will be easy, but I'd like to face it with you if you'll have me." Lillian's answer was to rise on her tiptoes and press her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief but filled with promise, and when she pulled away, her eyes shone with happiness. "I'd like that very much," she whispered. The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality for both of them. Preston moved his few belongings into Lillian's cabin, taking up residence in the small lean-to that served as a second room. Though they both knew their feelings ran deep, they were equally committed to propriety, at least until their future was more firmly established. Together, they worked to improve the homestead. Preston repaired the roof that had begun to leak in one corner, built better pens for Lillian's goats, and helped her expand the garden. Lillian taught him about the medicinal plants she was cultivating, knowledge she had gained from books and her time in San Francisco. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing, their pasts, their hopes, the small victories and challenges of each day. Sometimes they would simply sit in companionable silence, Preston whittling a piece of wood while Lillian mended clothing or sketched plans for the homestead's expansion. As weeks passed, their relationship deepened, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared hardship. The memory of Lillian's illness and Preston's desperate ride for medicine was never far from their minds, a reminder of how precious and precarious life could be. One evening, as summer gave way to early autumn, Preston returned from checking fence lines to find Lillian sitting on the porch steps, a troubled expression on her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. She looked up, her eyes serious. "Mr. Henderson came by while you were out. He brought news from town." Preston sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "What news?" "There's been talk of railroad surveyors in the area," she explained. "They're planning a spur line that would pass not far from here. Henderson says it could change everything, bring more settlers, raise land values." "That could be good for us," Preston observed. "Make it easier to get supplies, maybe sell some of what we produce." Lillian nodded slowly. "Yes, but it also made me realize something." She turned to face him fully. "Preston, we've been living in this wonderful uncertainty for months now, but we haven't really talked about what comes next." Preston took her hand in his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "What do you want to come next, Lillian?" She took a deep breath. "I want us to be real. Not just something that happened because you saved my life and felt responsible for me. Not just convenient because we both needed help." "Is that what you think this is?" Preston asked softly. "Convenience? Responsibility?" Lillian shook her head. "No, not really. But sometimes I wonder if you miss your old life, the freedom of it, if someday you might want that back." Preston was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully. "I won't lie to you, Lillian. There are things I miss: the camaraderie of the other hands, the simplicity of taking orders instead of making all the decisions." He squeezed her hand gently. "But I found something here with you that I didn't even know I was looking for, something that matters more." Relief softened her features. "So you don't regret staying?" "Not for a single moment," he assured her. "Then perhaps," Lillian said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we should consider making this arrangement more permanent." Preston's heart quickened at her words. "Are you asking me to marry you, Lillian Shaw?" A blush colored her cheeks, but her gaze remained steady. "I suppose I am, though it's terribly forward of me." A slow smile spread across Preston's face. "Well, you've never been one for convention, have you?" He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "And as it happens, I've been carrying something around for weeks now, waiting for the right moment." From his pocket, he withdrew a simple gold band. It wasn't fancy or elaborate, but it shone in the fading sunlight, a promise made tangible. "I had planned something more romantic," Preston admitted with a rueful smile. "But since you've beaten me to it, Lillian Shaw, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Preston slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her in his arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of all they had survived together and all they hoped to build. They were married 2 weeks later in McGill, with Dr. Simmons and Mr. Henderson serving as witnesses. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, particularly when the minister spoke of the couple's journey from strangers to life partners. "It is not often," the minister observed, "that we see so clearly God's hand in bringing two souls together. That a chance encounter in the wilderness, born of the direst necessity, could lead to such profound love is a testament to the mysterious ways in which our paths are guided." Afterwards, as they drove their wagon back toward their homestead, their home, Lillian leaned her head against Preston's shoulder, contentment washing over her. "Do you realize," she said softly, "that if I hadn't fallen ill, if you hadn't found me when you did, we might never have met at all?" Preston's arm tightened around her waist. "I try not to think about that," he admitted. "But I do believe some things are meant to be, even if the path getting there is harder than we might wish." Lillian smiled up at him. A fever took me miles from any town. A cowboy rode 3 days for medicine and saved my life. And somehow, in the midst of all that struggle, we found each other. And I wouldn't change a single moment of it, Preston replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead as their wagon rolled homeward beneath the vast Nevada sky. In the years that followed, the Abernathy homestead flourished. The railroad did indeed bring changes to the region, but Preston and Lillian were prepared, adapting their plans to take advantage of the new opportunities. They expanded their property, adding cattle to their holdings and establishing a reputation for fine wool from Lillian's carefully bred sheep. Their family grew as well. Their first child, a son they named James after Lillian's father, arrived a year after their marriage. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Eleanor, who had her mother's blonde hair and her father's blue eyes. A second son, Michael, completed their family 3 years after that. The cabin that had once seemed so small and isolated became the heart of a thriving ranch, expanded room by room as their needs changed. Lillian's medicinal garden grew into a small business of its own, her remedies sought after throughout the region. Preston, drawing on his years of experience with horses, began breeding and training stock that commanded premium prices at the territorial fairs. Through it all, the difficult years and the prosperous ones, the joys of watching their children grow, and the inevitable sorrows that life brings, the foundation of their partnership remained unshaken. The bond forged during those desperate days of Lillian's illness and Preston's determined quest for medicine only strengthened with time and shared experiences. On the 10th anniversary of the day Preston had found Lillian by that creek, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard that had once been just wild scrubland. "Do you ever wonder," Lillian asked, her head resting against her husband's shoulder, "what would have happened if you hadn't decided to check on that woman Dr. Simmons mentioned?" Preston's arm tightened around her waist. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at all we've built together, at our children, at you." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "And I know that somehow we would have found each other anyway. Some things are just meant to be." Lillian rose on her tiptoes to kiss him, her heart as full as it had been on the day she realized this man who had saved her life had also captured her heart. "I believe you're right," she whispered against his lips. "Some things are indeed meant to be." And as the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the Nevada sky in brilliant streaks of orange and red, just as it had on the day their story began, Preston and Lillian Abernathy stood together, grateful for the fever that had nearly taken her life but had instead given them both something far more precious. A love that had not only survived against impossible odds but had flourished, becoming the foundation upon which they had built their lives together.